Hi, I'm Carl Weber. Welcome to Video Aided Instructions English Grammar Series. This is the Sentence Complements program. Do you like compliments? Most people do. Gee, I like what you've done with this apartment. Your hair looks good today. Great shoes. Well, the kinds of compliments we'll be talking about in this program are a little different. The kind of compliments I just talked about are spelled C-O-M-P-L-I-M-E-N-T-S. The compliments we'll be talking about in this program use the letter E in place of the letter I. And that word complement is connected with the verb complete. To complete something is to finish it or to round it out. And a sentence complement is a word or a group of words that completes the thought begun by the subject and the verb in a sentence. We've been talking in other programs in this series about how a sentence is a bit like a machine made up of various parts. The sentence complement is one of the important kinds of parts that go to make up a sentence, and it's important that you understand how to use sentence complements in order to express your meaning clearly and accurately. In this program, we'll talk about the different kinds of sentence complements and give you some basic rules for using them correctly in English sentences. Before we can talk directly about sentence complements, we need to talk about three kinds of verbs in English. As you'll see, each of these three kinds of verbs is related to a particular type of sentence complement. The three main kinds of verbs in English are transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. Let's take a look at each. A transitive verb expresses action that passes from the subject of the verb to an object of the verb. As you recall, a verb is a word that expresses action or state of being. A transitive verb is always an action verb. The subject of the verb is the person or thing that does the action of the verb. The object of a transitive verb receives the action. Take a look at this sentence as an example. Omar typed the letter. Now, what's the verb in this sentence? The verb is the word typed. What's the subject of the verb typed? That is, who or what did the typing? The answer is Omar. So Omar is the subject, typed is the verb. Now, this is a transitive verb because it has an object, that is, something that receives the action of the verb. Who or what receives the action of the typing in this sentence? The answer is letter. The word letter is a noun which is receiving the action of the verb typed, and therefore it's the object of the verb. Because the verb typed has an object which receives the action, we refer to typed as a transitive verb. Here's another example. Lorraine swam 20 laps. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is swam. What's the subject of the verb swam? That is, who or what did the swimming? The answer, Lorraine. Lorraine swam. Now, what did Lorraine swim? That is, what receives the action of the verb swam in this sentence? The answer is laps. Laps is a noun which receives the action of the verb swam. It tells us what Lorraine swam. So laps is the object of the verb swam, and therefore, in this sentence, swam is a transitive verb, because only a transitive verb expresses action that passes from the subject of the verb to an object. Now, the second type of verb is an intransitive verb. As you may know, the prefix in English usually means not. It takes the meaning of the word and reverses it or negates it. So you might be able to guess that an intransitive verb is a verb that is not transitive, and that's exactly right. Here's the definition. An intransitive verb expresses action that does not have an object. We saw a moment ago that a transitive verb has an object which receives the action of the verb. An intransitive verb doesn't have such an object. Take a look at this sentence. Elliot slept. This is a short sentence, only 2 words, but it is a complete sentence. It has a subject and a verb, and it expresses a complete thought. In this sentence, the verb is slept, and the subject is Elliot. And the verb does not have any object. It expresses a complete thought without having an object. We don't need to ask, what did Elliot sleep? Because the meaning is complete without any object. Elliot slept, that tells us exactly what happened. It's perfectly clear, and it doesn't sound incomplete. So slept in this sentence is an intransitive verb. It has no object, and it doesn't need one. Here's another example. Jacques laughed. Again, it's a very short sentence, but it is complete. It contains a subject and a verb. The verb is laughed. The subject is Jacques. Jacques is the one doing the laughing. And there is no object. The sentence doesn't tell us what Jacques laughed. He simply laughed. That's a complete thought, a complete idea in itself, and no object is needed. Once again, we're dealing with an intransitive verb in this sentence. The third type of verb is a linking verb. A linking verb expresses a state of being. It links the subject to another word in the sentence. Remember that our definition of verb explains that a verb is a word that expresses an action or a state of being. Both transitive and intransitive verbs express actions. A linking verb expresses a state of being. Rather than telling us what the subject does, it tells us what the subject is. The most common linking verb is be, and the word be in many different forms is found in lots of sentences. Some other common linking verbs are act, appear, seem, taste, and turn. And there are quite a few others. You can recognize a linking verb by the fact that what follows the linking verb and the subject of the linking verb are in some way the same. The linking verb is called a linking verb because it links those two things and in some way equates them or tells us that they are one and the same thing. Here are a couple of examples. Karim is a school teacher. We said a moment ago that the verb to be is the most common linking verb. Here's an example of a form of the verb to be. The verb is. What's the subject of the verb is? Karim. Karim is the one who is. And following the verb is, we're told exactly what Karim is, a teacher, or specifically a school teacher. So in this case, the subject Karim is being linked by the linking verb is to the word teacher. Karim is teacher. And the words a school are giving a little more information about what kind of teacher. Notice that is operating here as a linking verb because it's linking Karim and teacher. It's telling us that Karim and teacher are in some way the same thing. And in fact, they are. That's what Karim is. So the two things are being linked or equated to one another. And that's how a linking verb works. As I've said, the verb to be is the most common linking verb, but there are a number of others. Here's an example. Leanna looked nervous. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is looked. The subject is Leanna. That tells us who looked. And the word that follows looked is the word nervous. And this is being linked to Leanna by the linking verb looked. We can tell that in this sentence, looked is operating as a linking verb because Leanna and the word that follows, nervous, are being linked or equated with one another. We're being told that Leanna and nervous are in some way the same thing. And in fact, we know that Leanna is nervous. Notice that in this case, the verb looked, which is a linking verb in this sentence, is being used to mean almost the same as the verb to be. When we say that Leanna looked nervous, we're saying in a way that Leanna is or was nervous. So the verb looked is being used as a linking verb in a way that's similar to the way the verb to be is used. We're being told that Leanna and nervous are linked or equated in some way. And that's why looked is being used in this sentence as a linking verb. One more example. Edgardo felt optimistic. In this sentence, the verb is felt, and the subject is Edgardo. And what did Edgardo feel? He felt optimistic. Once again, felt is being used as a linking verb in this sentence because Edgardo and optimistic are being linked. They are being equated. When we say that Edgardo felt optimistic, that's Almost the same thing as saying he was optimistic. It's just putting a slightly different meaning on it. So in this sentence, felt is being used as a linking verb, and what comes before and after the linking verb, those two things are being equated or being made to appear the same. Edgardo and optimistic go together, and that's why felt is considered a linking verb in this sentence. These then are the three kinds of verbs: transitive verbs, intransitive verbs, and linking verbs. And as you'll see in a moment, it's important to understand the difference in order to understand how sentence complements are used. Notice that some verbs can be used as more than one kind of verb. In other words, the very same verb word can be used in a transitive way or an intransitive way, or perhaps as a linking verb. Take a look at these examples. Miguel ran. Here's a short sentence which expresses a complete thought in itself. The verb is ran, the subject is Miguel, and when we read this sentence we understand Miguel ran. Perhaps he's a runner on the track team and went out running this morning, and we could say, well, Miguel ran. This could be a complete sentence, and in this case the verb ran is being used as what kind of verb? Transitive, intransitive, or linking? In this case, ran is being used as an intransitive verb. Remember that an intransitive verb doesn't have any object. The action simply stops with the verb ran, and the action does not pass on to an object that follows the verb. Miguel ran, a complete sentence in itself, and ran is an intransitive verb. But now compare it to this sentence. Jorge ran the car wash. Here we have the same verb, ran, but it's used in a very different way than in the previous sentence. In the previous sentence, we saw that the verb ran had no object. Miguel ran, and that was the end of the sentence. In this case, the verb ran does have an object. The action of the verb ran is being passed on to something which is receiving that action, namely the car wash. That is what Jorge ran. So in this sentence, the verb ran, this very same verb that we saw a moment ago being used as an intransitive verb, is being used as a transitive verb, a verb that has an object which receives the action of the verb. So these two sentences show us that the same verb can sometimes be used as either a transitive verb or an intransitive verb. Here's another example of how the role played by the same verb may change from one sentence to the next. Anna grew tomatoes. In this sentence, the verb is grew. The subject is Anna. Now, what did Anna grow? Is there an object to the verb grew? Yes, there is. She grew tomatoes. So the noun tomatoes is the object of the verb grew. It receives the action of the verb. Therefore, what kind of verb is grew in this sentence? It's a transitive verb, because remember, only transitive verbs pass the action along to an object. Compare that with this sentence. Tova grew hungry. Here we have the same verb, grew, but the meaning is a little different, and the structure of the sentence is different. In this case, the verb grew doesn't have an object. This word hungry doesn't tell us a thing that Tova grew, the way Anna grew tomatoes. Hungry isn't a noun, and it doesn't name some object which receives the action of the verb grew. Instead, it tells us what Tova was. Therefore, what kind of verb is grew? In this case, grew is being used as a linking verb. The two words Tova and hungry are being linked or equated. We're being told, in effect, that Tova was hungry. She grew hungry, that is, she got to be hungry over time, but in effect, the two things are being equated with one another. Tova was hungry. That's another way of saying almost the same thing as Tova grew hungry. So in this particular example, the verb grew is being used as a linking verb. It is linking Tova and hungry. The two things are being equated with one another. Hungry is not the object of the action. It's not receiving the action in the way the tomatoes received the action of growing in the sentence about Anna. Instead, grew is being used as a linking verb, and Tova and hungry are being equated with one another. Once again, notice that the very same verb can be used with different meanings to play a different role in a sentence. So the same verb may be a transitive verb or an intransitive verb or a linking verb. You can't tell what type of verb a verb is just by looking at the verb in isolation. Instead, you have to look at it in the context of the sentence and understand how it's being used and how it relates to the words nearby. In your study guide, we've provided an exercise which will enable you to test your understanding of these concepts. In this exercise, your job is to look at the underlined verb in each sentence and decide whether it's being used as a transitive verb, an intransitive verb, or a linking verb. Let's start with the first sentence. The author Earl Stanley Gardner wrote a number of books using the pen name A.A. Fair. Now in this sentence, the verb wrote is underlined. In order to determine whether it's a transitive verb, an intransitive verb, or a linking verb, you need to decide whether it's a verb of action or a verb of being. And if it's a verb of action, whether there is something in the sentence which receives the action of the verb. Well, in this case, wrote is being used as a verb of action. It is telling us something that the author Earl Stanley Gardner did. And is there anything in the sentence which receives the action of the verb wrote? That is, does the sentence tell us something that Earl Stanley Gardner wrote? The answer is yes. There is something that receives the action of the verb in this sentence. It's the word number. Or to give the entire phrase, it's a number of books. That's what he wrote. He wrote a number of books. And therefore, there is an object that's receiving the action of the verb. The verb wrote, its action flows through to a number of books. Therefore, wrote is being used as a transitive verb. Because remember, only a transitive verb has an object which follows it, which receives the action of the verb. Let's look at the next example. Upon closer examination, several spokes of the bicycle's rear wheel appeared broken. In this sentence, the verb appeared is underlined. Let's begin by asking, what's the subject of the verb appeared? The answer is the word spokes. Don't be misled by the fact that several words come between the word spokes and the word appeared. It's the spokes that appeared broken. What kind of spokes? The spokes of the bicycle's rear wheel. So that prepositional phrase, of the bicycle's rear wheel, simply modifies or gives more information about the spokes. That's not where the actual subject of the verb appears. The subject is spokes. So the spokes appeared broken. Now, in this case, is appeared being used as a verb of action or a verb of being? Well, it's being used as a verb of being because it's not telling us something that the spokes did. It's telling us something that the spokes were. Namely, they were broken. The word appeared is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And the two things are being linked. The spokes, which is the subject of the verb appeared, and the word broken, which comes after the verb, those two things are being linked, and we're being told that the spokes were broken. What comes before and after the verb are being equated in this sentence, so appeared is being used as a linking verb. Our next example. Ivan and Sasha danced together until 2 o'clock, when the band finally stopped playing. Now in this sentence, the word danced is underlined, so that's the verb that we want to focus on. What's the subject of the verb danced? The answer is Ivan and Sasha. Remember that the subject of a verb may be compound. That is, it may be two nouns that are joined by a word like and. So Ivan and Sasha are the subject of the verb danced. Now, does the verb danced here have an object which receives the action of the dancing? That is, are we being told something that Ivan and Sasha danced? Not in this sentence. We're being told that they danced together. That tells us how they danced. And we're being told that they danced together until 2 o'clock, which is a little more information about how they danced. The word together is an adverb because it gives more information about or modifies the verb danced. It tells us how they danced. And until 2 o'clock is a prepositional phrase that also gives us more information about how they danced. Neither one, however, is an object, and neither one is being linked to Ivan and Sasha. Neither one tells us what Ivan and Sasha were. Therefore, the verb danced, in this case, doesn't have an object, and it's not being used as a linking verb. It is an intransitive verb. Remember that an intransitive verb is a verb of action that doesn't have an object receiving the action, and that's the case in this sentence. The verb danced is being used here as an intransitive verb. Notice, by the way, that the verb danced can be used as a transitive verb. You could imagine a sentence in which there is an object receiving the action of the verb danced. For example, you could say, Ivan and Sasha danced the polka. In that sentence, the word polka would be receiving the action of the verb danced. It would be telling us what they danced. And we would have transformed the verb danced from an intransitive verb to a transitive verb, because there would be an object receiving the action of the verb. There is no such object in this sentence, and therefore the correct answer for this sentence in your exercise is intransitive. The next sentence. Even by modern engineering standards, the pyramids of Egypt remain an incredible achievement. The verb remain is underlined. What's the subject of the verb remain? What remain an incredible achievement? The answer is pyramids. Once again, the fact that some other words come between the subject and the verb shouldn't confuse you. It's not Egypt that remains an incredible achievement. It's the pyramids that remain an incredible achievement. Now, what about the words that follow remain? How do those relate back to the verb? Are they the object of the verb? That is, do they receive the action of the verb, or do they play some other role? Well, in this case, remain is not a verb of action, but rather a verb of being, and therefore you can probably anticipate that it's being used as a linking verb, because that's how verbs of being are used. And sure enough, what follows the verb remain is an incredible achievement. These words explain what the pyramids of Egypt are. They are an incredible achievement. So what comes before and after the verb in this sentence, those two things are being equated. We're being told that they are the same as one another. And that makes the verb remain a linking verb. Our next example. Working with extreme care, the bomb squad removed the suspicious package. In this sentence, the verb removed has been underlined, and the subject of the verb is the bomb squad, or specifically the word squad. Now, what did the bomb squad remove? Is there an object for the action of this verb? Yes, there is. The object is the noun package, or to give the complete phrase, the suspicious package. So the package is receiving the action of the verb removed. It's telling us what they removed, and therefore package is the object of the transitive verb in this sentence. So for this last example in the exercise, the verb is being used as a transitive verb. Did you get all 5 of these questions right? I hope so. Let's turn now to Lesson 2. Now remember, the topic of this program is sentence complements. Everything we've been looking at so far relates to words or groups of words that complete the meaning of the subject and the verb. In the next lesson and the ones to follow, we're going to be talking about different kinds of subject complements. First, direct objects. A direct object is a noun or a pronoun that receives the action of a transitive verb. It answers the question, what or whom, after the transitive verb. By now, you're probably fairly familiar with the idea that a transitive verb passes the action along to some object. Well, technically, this is known as a direct object, and the reason that that particular term is important will become clear in a few moments when we move on to Lesson 3. A direct object is always a noun or a pronoun, and it receives the action of the transitive verb. So anytime a verb is being used as a transitive verb in a sentence, you can be sure that it's followed somewhere by a noun or a pronoun which receives the action of the verb and which is known as the direct object. Of course, there may be other words nearby that modify or give more information about the direct object, but the one-word noun or pronoun that receives the action, that's what's known as the direct object. Take a look at this example. Elaine washed her car. What's the verb here? Washed. The subject, Elaine. And what did Elaine wash? She washed her car. Where's the noun or pronoun that tells us exactly what Elaine washed? The noun car tells us what Elaine washed. And so that's the direct object of the verb washed. The word her, which is a possessive pronoun, gives us a little more information about the car. It modifies the noun car by telling us which car, whose car it was. But the word car, that noun, is the direct object. It receives the action of the transitive verb washed. One more example. Derek applauded the band. What's the verb here? Applauded. The subject of the verb? Derek. And who or what did Derek applaud? Well, Derek applauded the band. So band, that noun, is the direct object of the transitive verb applauded. The article, is thrown in to give a little more information, to modify the band, to tell us which band. But the word band, that noun, is the direct object of the verb applauded. One more thing to realize about direct objects: they may be compound. We've already seen in this series that both subjects and verbs may be compound. That is, more than one word may be part of the subject and the verb, and the two or more subjects or verbs would then be joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and. The same can be done with direct objects. That is, one sentence, one verb, may have more than one direct object, and the two or more direct objects would be joined by a coordinating conjunction, such as and. Here's an example. Dawn bought a blouse and a pair of shoes. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is bought. The subject, Dawn. She's the one who did the buying. Now, is there anything in the sentence that tells us what Dawn bought? Anything that receives the action of the buying? Well, the answer is there are really two things that Dawn bought. She bought a blouse and a pair of shoes. The two main nouns in those phrases would be the direct objects, blouse and pair. The other words that are there give us a little more information. What kind of blouse? A blouse. What kind of pair? A pair, and a pair specifically of shoes. So those other words give us more information about what kind of blouse and what kind of pair. Those two nouns, blouse and pair, are the two words that both go to make up the direct object in this sentence. So this is an example of how a sentence may contain a compound direct object with two or more things, both of which receive the action of the transitive verb, in this case, bought. Turn to your study guide. We have an exercise now that will test your ability to recognize direct objects when they appear in sentences. Try your hand at the exercise and then come back and we'll look at the questions together. In this exercise, your assignment was to decide whether a direct object appears in the sentence. Not all of the sentences contain direct objects. In order to decide whether there's a direct object or not, you need to begin by finding the verb and then looking to see whether there's a word that receives the action of the verb. Let's begin. The voters in Lincoln County have selected Anderson for the state legislature 4 times in a row. Let's begin by finding the verb in this sentence. The verb is have selected. Remember that some verbs contain more than one word, in which case we refer to it as a verb phrase. In this sentence, have selected is the verb phrase, which gives the action to the sentence. What is the subject of the verb have selected? That is, who or what is doing the selecting? The answer is the voters. The voters are the one who have selected. Now, is there any word that receives the action of the verb have selected? That is there any word that answers the question what or whom after the verb have selected? Well, the answer is the voters have selected Anderson. Anderson receives the action of the verb have selected, and therefore Anderson is the direct object of the verb in this sentence. The next example. General Sullivan led a fascinating tour of the historic Civil War battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Once again, what's the verb? The verb is led. The subject of the verb is General Sullivan. General Sullivan is the person who led. Now, what did General Sullivan lead? What or whom did he lead? Is there a word that answers that question? That is, a word which receives the action of the verb led? Yes, what he led was a tour, specifically a fascinating tour. But the noun tour is the key word. That's the direct object of the verb led. It tells us what General Sullivan led. The other words there, fascinating, give more information about the tour. They tell us what kind of tour it was. Notice that all the other words that follow the word tour in this sentence again go to give more information about the action. They don't receive the action directly, they just give more information about it. What kind of tour was it? It was a tour of the historic Civil War battlefield. And where was that battlefield? In Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. Those two groups of words are prepositional phrases, and the prepositional phrases give more information about the action. They don't receive the action of the verb directly. One tip when you're looking for the direct object of a verb is that the direct object will never be found in a prepositional phrase. The prepositional phrase may give more information about the object, but the prepositional phrase will never contain the object of the verb. That's how we know that those words of the historic Civil War battlefield in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, don't contain the direct object. The direct object is the word tour. Next example. Paula exercised in the weight room at the local gymnasium 3 times a week this past summer. What's the verb here? The verb is exercised. What's the subject? Who did the exercising? Paula. Paula exercised, that's the subject and the verb. Now, is there a word that receives the action of the verb exercised? That is there a word that answers the question, Paula exercised what? Or Paula exercised whom? Well, the answer is there is no word that answers that question. We're not told, for example, that Paula exercised her dog or Paula exercised her rights. Either of those might be the direct object of the verb exercised, but we're not told that at all. Paula exercised, and the action ends with the word exercised. All the other words in the sentence give more information about how and where and when she did the exercising, but they do not receive the action of the exercising. Therefore, there is no direct object for the verb exercised in this sentence. Remember, that means that the verb exercised is an intransitive verb. It doesn't have a direct object which receives the action. Next example. The theories of Isaac Newton revolutionized physics and astronomy. The verb here is revolutionized. What's the subject? The subject is theories. It was the theories that revolutionized. And what did they revolutionize? That is, what receives the action of the verb revolutionized? Well, in this case, there are 2 things that were revolutionized, physics and astronomy. So both of those words are part of the direct object of the verb revolutionized. So we have, in this sentence, a compound direct object. Remember, a direct object can include 2 or more things, joined usually by a coordinating conjunction, like and. So in this sentence, there are 2 direct objects joined by the word and, physics and astronomy. Our last example. Benjamin Franklin's first job was working as an apprentice in a printing shop. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is was. And perhaps you could recognize right away that this is not the kind of verb that has a direct object. Was is a form of the verb to be. And remember, to be is the most common and most important of the linking verbs. To be is naturally a verb of being rather than a verb of action. And remember that only verbs of action can be transitive verbs. Only verbs of action can pass their action along to a direct object. So this particular sentence does not have a direct object. It's the second example in this exercise of a sentence that doesn't have a direct object. The verb was has as its subject job, and what follows tells us what the job was. It was working as an apprentice in a printing shop. So was is being used as a linking verb, and what comes before and after the linking verb, those two things are being equated. We are being told that they are one and the same. This is different from having a direct object which receives the action of the verb. So for this sentence, there is no direct object. We've been talking about direct objects which receive the action of the verb. There's another type of object that a verb may have. It's called an indirect object. An indirect object is a noun or a pronoun that answers the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom, after a transitive verb. An indirect object comes between the verb and the direct object in a sentence. The sentences we've been looking at so far under the heading of direct objects contain a subject, a transitive verb, and then a direct object which receives the action of the verb. Some sentences that contain transitive verbs also contain indirect objects. Not all, not even most, but some sentences will contain that indirect object as well. The indirect object tells us to whom or for whom the action has been done, and the indirect object actually appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. If this sounds a bit confusing, look at this example, which should make it all very clear. Andrea told her mother the good news. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is told. That tells us what was done. And who or what is the subject? Andrea. Andrea is the one who did the telling. Now, what's the direct object of the verb told? That is, what did Andrea tell? Andrea told what? She told the good news. The noun news specifically is the direct object. That's what Andrea told. However, we notice there's another noun, her mother. That phrase has been stuck in between the direct object and the verb. What role does her mother play? Her mother is the indirect object. That answers the question, to whom Andrea told the good news. So the direct object is news, that's what Andrea told, and her mother is the indirect object. That's the person to whom the news was told. So you notice that a specific type of transitive verb is necessary to make an indirect object make sense. A verb like tell is one that makes sense as having an indirect object, because it's the kind of verb where you would do the action to someone or for someone. You tell someone some news. That is, you tell the news to a particular person. So in this case, mother, that noun, is the indirect object of the transitive verb told. And notice that the indirect object has been placed in between the verb and the direct object. When you learn English, that's one of the things that you learn, perhaps unconsciously. Little children who are learning English at their mother's knee never learn this rule, that is, that an indirect object appears in such and such a place in the sentence, but somehow, just from hearing hundreds and thousands of English sentences, they come to understand that a noun or pronoun that's been placed in that location in a sentence is serving in that way. It's answering the question, to what, to whom, for what, or for whom, and therefore it's serving as the indirect object. Here's another sentence to illustrate how this works. Stuart bought Donna a bouquet of flowers. The verb is bought. The subject is Stuart. Stuart did the buying. And what did Stuart buy? That is, what's the direct object? He bought a bouquet, specifically a bouquet of flowers. But the noun bouquet is the direct object of the verb bought. Now, for whom or to whom did he buy the bouquet? Well, he bought the bouquet for Donna. And by simply inserting the word Donna there in between the verb and the direct object, we know that Donna is serving as the indirect object. Donna tells us for whom Stuart bought the bouquet. So Donna is the noun which serves as the indirect object in this sentence. Both of the examples we've looked at so far happen to use nouns as indirect objects, but a pronoun could be used equally well. So that, for example, that same sentence could read, Stuart bought her a bouquet of flowers. In this case, the pronoun her would substitute for Donna, and it would also act as the indirect object. An indirect object would always be a noun or a pronoun, but it could be either one. Notice that an indirect object is not the object of a preposition. We've said that the indirect object answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom. Each of those phrases, to what, to whom, for whom, is in fact a prepositional phrase, because to and for are prepositions, and the noun or pronoun that follows them makes up, with the preposition, a prepositional phrase. However, when you actually use the prepositional phrase in a sentence, then you no longer have an indirect object, even though the meaning is exactly the same. Grammatically, it would be considered something different and would be treated differently grammatically. Let me illustrate what I mean. Look at this sentence. Ray told his little sister a story. The verb is told, the subject is Ray. The direct object, that is, what did Ray tell, is story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Answer, sister, his little sister more specifically. So sister is the indirect object, and it's placed just where it is supposed to be, between the verb and the direct object. Now, here's another sentence that says the same thing, but doesn't contain an indirect object. Ray told a story to his little sister. In this sentence, we have the same verb, told, and the same subject, Ray. We even have the same direct object, story. That's what Ray told. Now, to whom did he tell the story? Well, he told his little sister. But in this case, little sister is not appearing as an indirect object. Notice that it's not placed between the verb and the direct object. Instead, it has been made part of a prepositional phrase and stuck on at the end of the sentence. To his little sister. The preposition to introduces the prepositional phrase. So even though the meaning is the same, in this case, the grammatical structure is different. The indirect object has been taken out of its proper place between the verb and the direct object and has been tacked on at the end with a prepositional phrase. Either construction is perfectly clear and either one is perfectly correct. We simply want to differentiate them so that you'll understand the difference between an indirect object and the object of a prepositional phrase. The meaning is the same, but grammatically they are different, and different rules would apply. Finally, an indirect object may be compound. Just as a direct object may include two or more things joined by a coordinating conjunction, the same can be true of an indirect object. Look at this sentence. Ms. Powell gave her mother and father a beautiful anniversary gift. What's the verb here? Gave. The subject, Ms. Powell. And what did Ms. Powell give? That is, what's the direct object? The answer, gift. She gave a gift, specifically a beautiful anniversary gift. Now, to whom did she give the gift? That is, what's the indirect object of the verb gave? The answer is mother and father. There are two indirect objects in this sentence because there are two people to whom the gift was given. Those two words, mother and father, joined by the coordinating conjunction and, go together to make up a compound indirect object in this sentence. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In this exercise, we gave you several sentences and asked you to decide for each one whether or not an indirect object appears. Let's take a look at them one by one. First, Moesha wrote her grandmother a long letter thanking her for the birthday gift. It's usually a good way to start to look for the verb in a sentence like this and then work from the verb outward. What's the verb in this sentence? The answer is wrote. Wrote is the word that contains the action of the sentence. And who or what is the subject? Who did the writing? The answer, Moesha. Now, is there a direct object? That is there something in the sentence which tells us what Moesha wrote? Something that receives the action of the verb wrote. Yes, what Moesha wrote was a letter, specifically a long letter. So the word letter is the direct object of the verb wrote. It tells us what Moesha wrote. Now the tricky question, is there an indirect object? That is there something in the sentence that tells us to what, to whom, or for whom the letter was written? Well, the letter was written to Moesha's grandmother, and that noun grandmother appears in the sentence between the verb and the direct object. Therefore, it's in the right place for an indirect object, and that, in fact, is what it is. So the noun grandmother is the indirect object here. It answers the question, to whom Moesha wrote the letter. And that's the answer for this first question. Next, after 2 days of debate, the town council awarded the road maintenance contract to a company owned by several local citizens. It's a long, complicated sentence, but let's break it down piece by piece, and I think you'll find it's not that difficult to understand. First, what's the verb? What's the action that's happening in this sentence? The answer is awarded. Who or what is the subject of the verb awarded? Who did the awarding? The answer, council, or more specifically, the town council. So council is the subject. Now, is there a direct object? Is there a word that tells us what the town council awarded? Yes, the answer is contract. They awarded the contract, or more specifically, the road maintenance contract. Now, what about an indirect object? Is there a word or phrase that answers the question to whom or to what the road maintenance contract was awarded? Well, the answer in a way is yes, the contract was awarded to a company owned by several local citizens. But this is not being used as an indirect object. Remember, an indirect object would have to be placed between the verb and the direct object. And that's not where the company is placed. The company instead is tacked on at the end of the sentence. Furthermore, notice that the company is mentioned in a prepositional phrase. And as we saw a moment ago, an indirect object is never part of a prepositional phrase. So in this case, company is not an indirect object. Instead, it's part of the prepositional phrase to a company, and therefore it is not, grammatically speaking, an indirect object, even though it answers the same question and conveys much the same meaning. From a grammatical standpoint, it's not an indirect object. Let's look at our next example. Every evening, Richard and Emily cooked us a wonderful meal using fresh ingredients from the local farm stands. What's the verb here? The verb is cooked. That describes the action of the sentence. Who or what did the cooking? Richard and Emily. They are the subject of the verb cooked, and it's, of course, a compound subject because there are two nouns there linked by the coordinating conjunction and. So Richard and Emily cooked. Now, what did they cook? That is, what's the direct object of the verb? What they cooked is a wonderful meal. So the noun meal is the direct object. Now, is there an indirect object, a word that appears between the verb and the direct object, which answers the question to what, to whom, for what, or for whom? Yes, the answer is us. The pronoun us answers the question for whom the wonderful meal was cooked. Lucky us. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object. It answers the question for whom the meal was cooked, and it appears between the verb and the direct object. So us, that pronoun, is the indirect object in this sentence. Next example. Each candidate prepared a written statement for the selection committee. What's the verb here? The verb is prepared. Who or what did the preparing? Each candidate. So the verb is prepared. What's the direct object? That is, do we know who or what the candidates prepared? Well, they prepared a written statement. So the noun statement is the direct object. Is there an indirect object, a word appearing between the verb and the direct object, which tells to whom or for whom the statement was prepared? The answer is no. There is no indirect object here. Once again, as in a previous example, we have an answer to the question for whom the statement was prepared, but it appears in the form of a prepositional phrase at the end of the sentence, rather than as a true indirect object. So the selection committee is the object of the preposition for, and that's simply a prepositional phrase that gives more information about the action. It really doesn't serve grammatically as an indirect object. So this sentence is another example of one that doesn't contain an indirect object. Our last example. 2 minutes before game time, the coach gave her players a final reminder about the crucial importance of teamwork. What's the verb in this sentence? The verb is gave. Who or what gave? The coach gave. So coach is the subject of the verb gave. Now, who or what did the coach give? What is the direct object of the verb gave? Well, what the coach gave was a reminder, specifically a final reminder. So reminder is the direct object of the verb gave. Now, does the sentence contain an indirect object, a word that tells us to whom or for whom that reminder was given? Yes, the answer is her players. So the noun players, which does appear between the verb and the direct object, is the indirect object in this sentence. It answers the question to whom the coach gave the reminder, and it appears in the proper location in the sentence, and therefore players is the indirect object in this sentence. Now, so far, we've looked at direct objects and indirect objects, and both of these are used in sentences that contain transitive verbs. Sentences that contain intransitive verbs don't have objects of any kind. The action of the sentence basically stops with the subject and the verb. Of course, modifying words and phrases may be added, but none of those constitutes an object of the action. Now, what about the third type of verb, that is the linking verb? Well, linking verbs are used with a different type of sentence complement known as subject complements. A subject complement is a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective that follows a linking verb and refers to, describes, or modifies the subject. Remember earlier in this program when we talked about how linking verbs work, we pointed out that linking verbs always connect the subject to something that follows the linking verb and which is being equated to the subject. We're being told that the subject is what follows the linking verb. Well, what follows the linking verb is a subject complement, and it will be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. Of course, other modifying words and phrases may be added, but when you're looking for the subject complement, you want to look for a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective following the linking verb, which is in some way being equated to or linked to the subject. Here are some examples. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. Was is the verb in this sentence, and it's a linking verb. As we've said many times, the most common linking verb is the verb to be, and was is a form of the verb to be. The subject of was is Virginia Woolf, a particular woman's name. So Virginia Woolf was, and what follows is the subject complement. The noun novelist describes or modifies the subject Virginia Woolf. It gives us more information about Virginia Woolf. It tells us what Virginia Woolf was, specifically a novelist. So was, the linking verb, is linking Virginia Woolf and novelist and telling us that the two things were equated to one another. Virginia Woolf was a novelist. The two things are one and the same. So this is a classic example of a linking verb being used to connect the subject to a noun, novelist, which is the subject complement. Here's a different example. The world's greatest bullfighter is he. What's the verb here? The verb is. It's another form of the common linking verb to be. What's the subject of the verb is? The subject is bullfighter. That's the noun, which is the subject of the verb, and the other words there give more information about bullfighter. Which specific bullfighter? The world's greatest bullfighter. Now, what follows the linking verb is the subject complement. We said that a subject complement may be a noun, a pronoun, or an adjective. Here's an example of a pronoun being used as the subject complement. He. This is a rather unusual kind of subject complement. You probably don't hear a lot of sentences like this. And indeed, pronouns are the most unusual kind of subject complement. But we thought we ought to give you this sentence because we've made the point that a subject complement may be a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. So here's an example using a pronoun, he, as the subject complement. Notice that the pronoun he rather than him is correct. We have a separate program in this series which talks all about using pronouns correctly. And we'll talk about pronoun case in that program. And pronoun case is what differentiates he from him. When a pronoun is being used as a subject complement, you would use what's called the nominative case, which is he rather than him. And that's technically why he is correct. This kind of sentence doesn't come up very often. Perhaps the most common situation in which the use of a pronoun as a subject complement comes up would be when you knock on someone's door and they say, "Who's there?" and you respond, "It is I." That would be a common use of the pronoun I as a subject complement. And because it's a subject complement, you want to use the nominative case I rather than me. So "it is I" is correct rather than "it is me." It's a small matter, doesn't come up a lot, but we've covered it now, and we're ready to move on to our third example of a subject complement. Sandra looked happy. Here, the verb is looked. The subject is Sandra, and looked in this case is being used as a linking verb because what follows isn't receiving the action of the verb, but rather it's equating or being equated to the subject. What follows is the adjective happy, which describes, modifies, refers to, or gives more information about the subject. We're being told that Sandra was happy. So Sandra and happy are being equated to one another. We're being told those two things are one and the same, Sandra and happy. So looked is acting here as a linking verb, and what follows is an adjective being used as the subject complement. So once again, a subject complement follows a linking verb, and it can be either a noun or a pronoun or an adjective. And just like the other forms of sentence complements that we've looked at in this program, a subject complement may be compound. In other words, there may be more than one word included in the subject complement, and the two or more words would normally be joined by a coordinating conjunction. For example, Gary is a singer and a dancer. Here we have the linking verb is, linking the subject Gary to two words which are nouns, which are the subject complements, singer, dancer. One more example. My favorite sports teams are the Denver Nuggets and the Colorado Rockies. Here the linking verb is are, teams is the subject, more specifically my favorite sports teams, and there are two nouns that serve as subject complements, Denver Nuggets and Colorado Rockies. Another example of how the subject complement can be compound. Try your hand at the next exercise in your study guide, which will give you a chance to practice the skills and information we've just shared with you. In some of these sentences, but not all, there's a subject complement. Let's look at each one and see if we can locate the subject complement. First, the original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team was the Colt 45s. First, look for the verb. The verb is was, and it is a linking verb, and that means we can probably expect to find a subject complement here. What's the subject of the linking verb was? The answer is nickname. We're being told in this sentence what the nickname was. Specifically, which nickname? The original nickname of the Houston Astros baseball team. But the noun nickname is the subject. And what's the subject complement? Where are we told what that nickname was? The answer is the Colt 45s. That's a noun that's being linked with nickname, and the two things are being equated. The nickname was Colt 45s. So Colt 45s is the answer. That's the subject complement in this sentence. Next example. Many investors use mutual funds as a way of buying shares in a wide range of companies. The verb here is use. Now, is use a verb of action or a verb of being? Well, the answer is it's a verb of action. It tells us something that the subject, investors, do, rather than something that they are. So use is not a linking verb. In fact, it's a transitive verb, and therefore will not be followed by a subject complement. What follows the transitive verb use is mutual funds, which is the direct object of the verb use. So this particular sentence doesn't contain a subject complement. Remember, only a linking verb will be followed by a subject complement. Next, After being reupholstered, the wing chair looked new. What's the verb here? The verb is looked. The subject is chair or wing chair. So the chair looked something. What did it look? It looked new. New is an adjective which describes or modifies or gives more information about the wing chair. So new, that adjective, is a subject complement. Looked is being used here as a linking verb. We're being told, in effect, what the wing chair was. It was new. The linking verb looked is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And so what follows, the adjective new, is being used as a subject complement. Next, Ronald Reagan became the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. What's the verb here? The verb is became, and the subject is Ronald Reagan. So we're being told in this sentence what Ronald Reagan became. Now, became in this sentence is, again, being used as a linking verb. What follows it is what Ronald Reagan was. Once again, the linking verb, even though it's not, in this case, a form of the verb to be, is being used almost as the equivalent of the verb to be. And what was Ronald Reagan? Well, he was the oldest person ever to serve as President of the United States. The noun person is the subject complement in this particular sentence. And all the other words that follow the verb there serve to give more information about exactly what kind of person, the oldest person, and so on. So in this particular sentence, the linking verb is became, and the subject complement is the noun person. Our final example. The hikers were exhausted and ravenous after their trek up Mount Washington. What's the verb in this sentence? Well, the verb is were. And were, of course, is a form of the verb to be, which is the most common and important of the linking verbs. The subject of the verb were is hikers, and what follows the verb were is what the hikers were. Therefore, it's the subject complement that gives us more information about the hikers. And the hikers were two things. They were exhausted and ravenous. Those are both adjectives which give more information about the hikers. So in this case, we have a compound subject complement. Two adjectives joined by the coordinating conjunction and both of those words go to give us more information about the subject of the linking verb were. Let's quickly review. In this program, we've talked about three kinds of sentence complements: direct objects, indirect objects, and subject complements. Remember that direct objects and indirect objects are used only with transitive verbs, while subject complements are used only with linking verbs. Now let's step back for just a moment. We've seen now how complete sentences are constructed. There's a verb in the middle, a subject usually appearing before the verb, and then very often a sentence complement of some kind that comes after the verb. You might almost think of a sentence as a lever or a teeter-totter, something like a seesaw, with the verb as being the fulcrum, the balancing point in the middle. The subject usually comes before that, and the sentence complement, if there is one, comes after that. You now have the complete structure of what most typical English sentences look like. And all the other words and phrases that may be added onto the sentence serve to give more information about or to modify the subject or the verb or the sentence complement. So if you understand how these three major parts of a sentence work together and how different parts of speech can be used to modify or give more information about them, you'll understand how virtually every English sentence is constructed. And that will make it much easier for you to create your own English sentences that are both grammatically correct and express your ideas clearly. I hope you found this program useful. Thank you for watching, and I look forward to seeing you on other programs in this series.